How big is our demographic dilemma and how did we get here?
Well, this has all been caused by the baby boom generation. Everything demography seems to come back to the baby boomers. If you accept that there was a baby boom in the 1950s, then it's quite logical to expect a baby bust 70 years later in the 2020s. This was always going to happen. It was predicted in a book called Boom, Bust and Echo, written by David Foote, an Australian-Canadian academic 20 years ago. And the argument is, and you can see it in those figures in that graphic that you put up and which was published in the Australian today, that the number of baby boomers now exiting the workforce, because they're in their 60s, heading towards their 70s, the number exiting the workforce is greater than the number of young millennials and alphas entering the workforce. And so as a consequence, our population still rises, and the population aged 15 to 64 still rises, from which you draw the majority of the workforce, but it rises at a slower rate. So over the last 60 years, even 70 years, the number of people added to the 15 to 64 demographic, they buy consumer goods, they reproduce, they pay taxes. The number of people added to that cohort every year increased by about 175, 180,000, helped along by high birth rate and also through immigration. Now, in the 2020s, the baby bust shows that will drop to about 110,000 just through natural forces. Was always going to happen. Now, if you toss in the fact that we have closed our borders 15 months ago, and it's probably going to mean that you have 2 years of not being able to draw in labour from overseas, then that becomes a real problem. You can kind of get away with closing the borders in terms of access to skilled labour for 12 months, which is what we've done. It's the second 12 months from now through to the middle of next year that is really going to play out as being difficult. The unemployment rate will drop. And I think that what we will see, hopefully, is wage rises, but we'll also see labour nicking, people being enticed from one industry to another. Yes, we've built an economy based on the presumption that we will have easy access to foreign labour, whether it's engineers from India or fruit pickers from another country or whatever. But in a time of pandemic, of course, that assumption has been exposed as being flawed. And my argument today in the Australian was that we need to be far more self-sufficient in training and skilling our own workforce, just as we need to be far more self-sufficient in manufacturing. We need to be able to manufacture stuff. We need to be able to train sufficient numbers of people in the right skill sets so that we retain independence. We're not dependent on other countries as much as we have been.
So you're very much on the message where Phil Lowe, the RBA governor, was last week. He made 2 points. Obviously, without the influx of migrants into Australia, there'll be some likely lift in wages, provided the businesses survive the pandemic, but there could be a lift in wages because there isn't just this continual flight of overseas workers. But he also made the point, it's really putting business on notice. You can't just import the skills you want. You're going to have to get off your backsides and go back to what we used to do and train up Australians, which is really good, I think, because we've got this decent cohort of young people who aren't doing the fruit picking jobs and the low skilled labour jobs because they don't want to do them. They can get government welfare, but they're not able to slot into the workforce because they may not have a university education, but the training for those old semi-skilled jobs has fallen away. So this is actually a good wake-up call, don't you think?
This is an absolute wake-up call on a whole range of fronts. We have lived life for the last 25 years, I think, on the presumption that there is this easy flow of people and students and workers from one country to another. Now, that flow, that sort of globalisation flow, is predicated on the assumption that you can move. But what if there is a global pandemic? No one ever quite thought of that, I think. Or if there are significant geopolitical tensions. When you think about it, if we want a country that is resilient, that is independent, that is self-sufficient, then yes, we do need to be able to refine our own oil. We should be able to manufacture a face mask somewhere on the Australian continent. We should be able to add value to our agribusiness product on the Australian continent, so in manufacturing, and we also need to be developing further the skill sets so we are not supermarket shopping, cherry picking for labour in other countries to the extent that we have been previously. I think there's always going to be a case for specialist niche labour and skills to be brought to Australia. I kind of get that, as well as humanitarian and refugees and so forth. But I think we need to be far more focused on building locally the skill sets and giving those opportunities to young Australians.
Wow. I hope we are, Bernard Salton, and good on you for starting a conversation yet again with the Australian community. We've got to drive. A pandemic is a bad thing, but it is an opportunity to reset policies that need resetting. So let's hope that happens. Thank you for your time.